Football back again with another video. Today I wanted to discuss wishful thinking and its fundamentally harmful nature. When it comes to achieving a result, grinding, getting the best that you can out of yourself, or any sort of self improvement, whether it comes to football and whether it comes to life, I believe that we as human beings we have a tendency to engage in wishful thinking, meaning that we want certain things to be true and we believe them to be true even if the evidence doesn't necessarily support that claim. And I believe that this sort of anti truth and anti reality mentality, even though we as human beings have a propensity for that, propensity for hope, and the fact that we believe the things that we're doing are the most effective ways to get us to where we want to get to, at the end of the day, the truth will out. The truth will prevail. If you're doing something, especially this relates to footballers, if you're doing something that isn't necessarily backed by any reality, backed by at least your observations, by some sort of science, or just any sort of empirical method, then whether that's individual, whether that's something that's collective, like the scientific method, then I believe that you're engaging in wishful thinking. And the way that this manifests in the football sphere is training. I think a lot of the times we engage in practices, we engage in drills, and we practice on techniques that are not effective, that essentially are akin to a waste of time. But we engage in these things because we wishfully believe that these things are going to help us to achieve our objectives. And most of the time, it would be to get better, to get on a certain team, or to arrive at some sort of semi professional and professional standard when it comes to football. And I think this idea of wishful thinking is perfectly summarized by Elon Musk in one of his press conferences. So let's just take a look at what he had to say about that.
One of the biggest mistakes people generally make, and I'm guilty of it too, is wishful thinking. Like you want something to be true, even if it isn't true. And so you ignore the things that, you ignore the real truth because of what you want to be true. This is a very difficult trap to avoid.
So straight from the horse's mouth. So that's pretty much a summary of what I believe wishful thinking to be. And let's see how it plays out in the training sphere. I think a lot of the times on YouTube and social media, we have this sort of grind culture in general. And football is not immune to that. We do have a lot of people that engage in this sort of wishful thinking when it comes to training. And I could just show you small examples here. And this isn't to knock this channel or whatever they're doing. I think they're to some extent they're helping the kids, but like we're going to see in the other sides, there are other ways to go about it that I believe are more effective. And when there are more effective methods in place, the only reason why you wouldn't switch over to those more effective methods is due to some sort of deceptive reality that you live in. So let's just take a look at some of these drills here, doing this with youth players.
Angles, good, turn, set, play, good, great touch, right foot, set, left foot, set, go, last one and then moving on, play, yeah, good, that way, play, yes, play, good, play, good, yeah, good, yes, 4 wide, touch, yeah, yeah, I don't move too early, like that, yep. Wait until he's set Aiden before you play it, yeah, touch. Take care of it. Yeah, go. Wait until he's set. 3-1. Bang. Yes!
So when you look at drills of this nature, what you find is they're working on they're mainly working on their passing technique, playing one touch passes, opening up the body and your body orientation before receiving the ball. And then they add this element of as the ball's traveling towards you, as you're opening up your body orientation is good. And there's this I think there's this like something on the iPad or some sort of a machine that's giving these colors. And so the players essentially have to look at the screen and essentially look at the color and then call that out. And that is expected to be the perception or scanning element of the exercise. And what I'm about to tell you now is the fact that this does not train scanning or perception at all. The only benefit that you get from doing this little shoulder check before receiving the ball is maybe at best, maybe you can focus on honing in the actual technical aspect of literally scanning like over your shoulder all the time. So I guess it's beneficial for habit building, but it does not explain the continuum of scanning, perception, and then how that relates to decision making. It does not relate to that in any capacity. And that is the type of training that is required for players to be able to be effective on the pitch. So at best here, if I were to look at this exercise, I would say they're training their one touch technique and their body orientation and getting the habit of scanning. But when you look at each of those things individually, yeah, okay, you could say I'm getting my technique better, but technique is essentially it's a byproduct, or at least it's heavily affected by your ability to perceive and make the decision. It's cognitive first and foremost. Okay, like your technique is your toolbox, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the cognitive abilities or you don't have the ability to perceive the game well enough, you could have the best toolbox in the world. You won't know how to apply it. It's a question of application. It was never a question of acquisition of skill. And this is fundamentally my problem, my criticism of this type of training. It doesn't train the full continuum. It's too isolated in nature. So, going back to the idea of wishful thinking, well, a lot of people do engage in wishful thinking. We established that. Well, what are the facts? What is the reality of football? What is the game telling us essentially to practice? Or what are some of the clues that the game can give us in order to help us to achieve effective training and effective practice? Well, the first fact, this is a fundamental fact, is I guess the best way to describe it is a study. Well, there was a study done, as usual. Before I get into this, I will always have the links to these studies in my description. There was a study done, I think, analyzing 60 games in the Bundesliga in the 2013-2014 season, and what they did is that they looked at the amount of time that players were actually in possession during the game, and they divided it by their position on the field. And so I'm taking this sort of conclusion. This is directly taken from the study, so I'll just read it out. The analysis of ball possession at the player level indicates shortest accumulated IBC. IBC is just, I think, in this study they used IBC as a code word, as an acronym for player possession, the amount of time that a player is in possession. IBC times for the central forward 0.49, 0.43 roughly, plus or minus, and the longest for goalkeepers 1 minute and 38, and central defenders 1 minute 38, and central midfielders 1 minute 27. So what essentially are the facts of this? Essentially, what the facts that they're telling us are essentially that on average, the player will be in possession of the ball for, let's say, roughly 2 minutes of the game. So you will actually have the ball at your feet or be able to engage in some meaningful way with the ball for 2 minutes out of a 90, let's say a 93-minute game, if we're assuming on average 3 minutes of stoppage time. So that equates to roughly 2% of the time, 2 or 3% of the time that you're on the field, you're actually having the ball. So what does that tell you? Well, logically, if you were to think about this logically, it would mean what about the rest of the 98% of the time when you're not receiving the ball? What are you doing then? And I think the stats that we currently have and the fixations and sort of the cultural trends that we have towards football and analysis and scouting is that we tend to overvalue or focus predominantly on that 2%. So what I mean by that 2% is when the player's in possession. Okay, well, how good is his technique? Can he hit the ball with outside of his foot? Oh, how's his long shot? How is his header of the ball? How are his short passes? How's his shot? Things like that. How great is his dribbling? How great is his one touch passing? How great is his first touch? Well, these factors are relevant in the game of football. At the end of the day, it only does account for 2% of what a player is actually doing on the field. So you have to take that in mind as well too when we tend to overvalue that 2% for the rest of the 98%. So that's something to consider. And that's just a fundamental truth about the game. So what I can prescribe to the person that wants to get better is, okay, well, coming from the model of you're only going to have the ball 2% of the time that you're on the pitch, well, I would tell the player that you have to get as good as possible at that 98%, that time when you're not on the ball. And what does that usually relate to? That relates to running. So there's a physical element to it, defensive effort, making runs off the ball, being communicative, and last but not least, your perception and your cognitive awareness. So it's a confluence of all these factors. So what I would prescribe at the basic level for a player is, like this slide suggests, get your body right. So let's use the World Cup here as a case study. The World Cup, this data is taken from the FIFA's data. I think they used semi-automatic tracking systems to measure running parameters for players during the World Cup, and I think this data is up to the group stages, so the first three games. And what we find on this slide here is the total distance covered by players during the World Cup. And what you find is this is a lot. This is on center mids. Obviously, what we find is on average center mids, like you look at Brozovic, they're definitely covering a lot more distance. We're looking at 13,000 meters, and then you're looking at fullbacks that are at 12,000 meters. And obviously, you would have goalies who run the least at around roughly 6,000 meters. So the first thing that I would prescribe to someone that wants to get better is you need to be able to look at this, look at these numbers as a benchmark for yourself to be like, am I running these distances anywhere close to these distances on the pitch? So it gives you a quantitative benchmark. So that's just total distance covered. So that's just a question of your lung capacity, heart capacity, things of this nature. But then also important is the amount of distance that they cover over 25 kilometers an hour. So this is essentially measuring the amount of distance that players are covering at a high speed. This is also important because the demands of the game is football is intermittent. It's an intermittent sport. So there's distance, you're going to have to cover long distances a lot of the times with low speeds, but then the high speed moments are the moments where the game is really decided. So this is very relevant to football players. So as usual, you see fullbacks, like as expected, fullbacks do tend to run at higher speeds more than players that are central, like midfielders and center backs, and then forwards are probably followed by wingers as the the players with the highest the speeds, the longest distance with high speeds. So this is also, like I said, this is something that you could use as a benchmark for yourself in your training to kind of just see what the standards are at, and it's quantifiable. And then here also another very important slide here is the top speed. I mean, looking at this really is humbling, and it puts things into perspective. If you look across all positions, everyone runs fast. Even goalies are literally running at 30 kilometers an hour top speeds. It's absolutely ridiculous. Obviously, fullbacks are the most. Alfonso Davies, ridiculous. I think that's the fastest that's been clocked so far. I think at the group stage level, the World Cup for that year, 35.6 kilometers an hour. And just to put that into perspective, like how fast that is, I think when Usain Bolt in 2008, when he ran that 9.58 in the 100 meters, he was running, his top speed was actually, I think, 43 or 44. But more interestingly, which blows that out of the water, which blows that 35 out of the water. But more interestingly, his average ground speed was roughly 38.58. And Alfonso's running a 35.6. And the reason why you can't make a one-to-one comparison with 100-meter sprinting and these stats is that a lot of the times footballers have to break, so they don't have the large running space that a 100-meter runner would have to be able to get into his full stride and actually achieve like his true top speed. So that's why I like to use the comparison of average ground speed when I'm comparing 100-meter sprinters to like footballers. So when you're looking at Usain Bolt, his world record, he was running at 37.58 kilometers an hour average ground speed. And then the fastest player that we have recorded here is running at 35.6. So just to put that in perspective, that's ridiculous. Football players are extremely fast, and this is across all positions. You look at fullbacks, 35, center backs, 34, even center mids, 34. You see at 34s, high 33s, and of course forwards at 34. So one thing that the stats tell us is that you have to be fast. You're gonna run for long distances, and you're gonna cover large amounts of distances at relatively high speeds. So those are the facts that you can take from the game itself in terms of physical preparation. Now, the other aspect that I want to talk about is you need to work on your mind, right? Instead of doing these technique drills and whatever these random these random just jumping around and just lollygagging in your training. You have to be very specific in what you train. Well, we talked about the body first and foremost, and then now we have to talk about the mind. Well, when you have the mind, you break it down into three aspects. You have the scanning, you have perception, and then you have executive functions. So the scanning is essentially like I showed in the other video. I think the Joner football video where they're doing the training, the scanning where they had to look at the screen and look at the color on the screen. That is essentially what scanning is. It's essentially moving your body, head, or eyes to expose the eye's retina to relevant information off the ball, and that in itself is a habit. So that's something that you constantly have to do in all moments before you receive the ball to kind of just get that ingrained into your psyche that that's what you have to do. So that's habitual. And then you have perception. Perception here is more cognitive in the sense that it relates to pattern recognition, which goes back to your tactical knowledge. It relates to multi-object tracking, which is also something that could be tracked with your IQ, your signal detection, and things of this nature, right? And then you have and then all of that essentially ties into your reaction, so it's how quickly you move in response to a signal. But then that differs from proaction is movement in response to something that is about to happen. So I think the perfect example is, I think a lot of midfielders, especially slow midfielders, you'll hear Thiago Motta, Xavi, or Fabregas say, well, they might be faster than me, but if I arrive in the space, if I start moving before they do, I will arrive in the space before they will eventually. So that is more of a description of proaction, and it relates as opposed to reaction. If we start a reaction is if we start at the same time, who arrives there quicker, who responds quicker to a stimulus. If we get the same stimulus at the same time, who will arrive there quicker. Proaction is more along the lines of, well, if I can predict, if I could see the thing happening in lifetime be quickly before my opponents do, I don't have to be the fastest. I can still arrive and be competitive. So it relates more to anticipation. And then executive functions, of course, you have a cognitive updating. It's the ability to replace or revise old memories with new ones. This is very important because a lot of times people do scan, so they are taking in a great deal of data and information on the pitch, but they are unable to revise this information and replace it with newer models. Right, because at the end of the day, when you receive before you receive the ball, you need to set up a model for what you want to do, a model of play for that situation. And then you have cognitive inhibition and cognitive flexibility. It's just essentially the ability to change course. So that also requires a bit of proprioception and the ability to really move your body reactively. And then cognitive inhibition, which is just the ability to delay or stop unwanted actions. So this is kind of the continuum that you have to understand. You have scanning, which is the habit, your perception, things that are related, and your perception, your executive functions was more related to spatial awareness, pattern recognition, and obviously your IQ as a player, your cognitive abilities. So, and that's how everything relates to your decision. So at the end of the day, the technical skill is there. Like we said, we're training those one-touch drills, we're training those two-touch drills, but it isn't as salient as scanning, perception, and executive functions when it comes to making good decisions on the pitch. So when you do your training, if you find that you're spending more than 50% of your time working on your technical skill, I would recommend that you rethink your training. You fundamentally have to rethink it because you have to look. And if what I'm working on is only relevant to maybe improving 10 or maybe even 5% of my game, why spend more than 50% of my time on that? So that's a discussion that it's a self reflection that the player has to have with themselves and their training program, right? And stop engaging in wishful thinking. And then lastly, this is kind of just a slide. This is a VIP camera, so it's a camera that essentially just fixates on one player in all moments of the game, so it doesn't follow the ball. And this is kind of just to give you an illustration of lifetime of what that continuum of scanning, perception, and executive functions kind of look like. So this is just I think this is maybe 2018-19 season or 19-20 season, Champions League against Napoli. We see here the scanning, the speed as well too of the actions. When you're really at that ground level, you really see how fast the game moves. The amount of fixations. You can imagine what's going on through his brain. He's cognitively just processing all the information around him. Scans, micro scans. And this goes to show again from a physical perspective, football is an intermittent sport. It's up and down. A lot of times he's walking. He's still covering distance, but he's walking, and then he prepares for the high intensity action. Right. So that's sort of just an example that I just wanted to give to just tell you in lifetime what that actually looks like. So I think that's it for today. Mr. FS Football out. Stop engaging in wishful thinking. You know, focus on results. Focus on the reality. The game at the end of the day is the best teacher. The game is the blueprint for how to train. You don't have to be lied to. You don't have to be finessed by people that are selling programs that are trying to take your money to get you better. Just stop engaging in wishful thinking and start training seriously.